Hey friends, tonight we're telling the story of an ordinary morning where a single mom was scrambling to pack breakfast for her daughter, completely unaware that just a few hours later, she'd shake the entire legal system with what seemed like a tiny, forgettable act. You know, there are days that start with a missing sock and end with a call from Washington, but that comes later. Right now, she's still trying to cool a milk box by blowing into the plastic lid. And if you think defending a janitor who got fired could never change your whole life, you might want to buckle up. So before you settle in, hit the like button and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy the kind of stories we tell here. And hey, drop a comment below telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now go ahead, turn off the lights, let the fan hum in the background, and drift with me into tonight's journey. Elena Rowe's tiny kitchen still smelled faintly of burnt toast from yesterday. She poured coffee with her left hand while her right hand struggled to wrap a peanut butter sandwich for her daughter. One hand of a mother, one hand of a public defender, and both trembling as the clock ticked past 7:48 a.m. "Hurry up, sweetheart. I've got a hearing today, and something about it just feels odd," she said, trying to keep her tone calm even as a blob of yogurt landed right inside her case file. Beneath those wrinkled court papers lay a case no one else wanted, a small labor dispute. The accused, Mr. Willis Dane, age 68, former janitor at a real estate firm, fired for threatening behavior toward a superior. No video footage, no witnesses, only one line quoted from an internal report. "Don't think you're untouchable. I've seen bigger men fall. Why did Elena take the case? Because no one else at her public defense office would. And because the cleaning lady who worked the same courthouse whispered to her, 'He's not like that.' Mr. Dane used to be somebody important. Important how? Nobody knew. That morning, Elena wore a wrinkled blouse, half steamed in the bathroom. Her daughter, May, 8 years old, left a crayon drawing on the kitchen table, two figures standing before a mountain with wobbly letters that read, "Mom will win because she has a good heart." Elena smiled. She tucked the drawing into her bag like a tiny shield. Then she stepped out of their 47-square-meter apartment, carrying not confidence but a quiet hunch. Something about this case doesn't sit right. If you've ever worked in a public defense office, you'll know there are cases that sit on the shelf for a long time. They don't make headlines, they don't come with glory, and they definitely don't offer prestige. They're like the junk folder in your email. Everyone scrolls past, no one opens. Willis Dane's file was one of those cases. 3 junior attorneys had already turned it down. One even said bluntly, "He's the kind of guy who uses his age to justify being rude. Impossible to defend." Another smirked. "Maybe he just got used to barking orders in the military." Elena Rowe didn't laugh, because buried in that file was something she couldn't unsee, a silence that was too clean. According to the complaint, the incident happened in an elevator on a Friday afternoon. No cameras, no witnesses. The building's manager, Craig Ellison, filed the complaint, stating that Mr. Dane had used a threatening tone and displayed aggressive body language. But as Elena combed through the report, something felt off. First of all, Craig was the son-in-law of the company's president. Second, in the entire report, there wasn't a single direct statement from Mr. Dane, just a temporary suspension notice followed by a formal termination 72 hours later. And third, Dane's personnel file was nearly blank. 3 lines: born 1955, former legal sector employee, assigned to Building 42 since 2018. Legal sector, a vague label no serious lawyer would leave unclarified. If you've ever been a judge, a lawyer, or even a court clerk, you have a detailed record. But here, nothing. Elena folded the papers and did something her colleagues would call a waste of time. She went to meet the man everyone referred to as the stubborn old janitor in the basement. That day, the detention area was eerily quiet. Mr. Dane sat behind the glass as if he had been waiting. His hands rested neatly on the table, nails trimmed, wrinkled skin but clean, and his eyes the kind that belonged to someone who had once looked down from the bench, not up from the defense table. "Mr. Dane, I'm Elena Rowe. I've been assigned to represent you at your preliminary hearing." He didn't speak, just nodded, a nod that was neither extra nor lacking. "Is there anything you want me to know? Anything that might help your case?" Still silent, Elena began to doubt herself. Maybe this was one of those dead-end cases, the kind public defenders call a career blind spot where the truth won't help you. But then Dane looked up and spoke for the first time, his voice steady, not loud, but enough to stop her pen mid-sentence. "I once stood where you're standing now, and I learned something. The law isn't a hammer, it's a rhythm. Whoever keeps the rhythm doesn't get swallowed." Elena furrowed her brow. "I'm sorry, what do you mean?" He shook his head, smiled faintly, like a man who didn't need to be understood. "You'll be fine. Just don't ignore the small details." And that was all he said that day. No apology, no anger, just a cryptic piece of advice from a 68-year-old man with a blank resume and a case nobody wanted. Elena left the room dizzy with questions she couldn't explain. But you know what some experts still argue? Those who've stood at the highest levels of power are often the best at hiding in plain sight. There's one question no one at the courthouse ever asked Elena Rowe. Why did she choose to become a public defender when she could have joined a high-paying law firm? And if they had asked, she probably would have just smiled, the kind of smile worn by those who've always stood at the edge of lives already written. Elena wasn't born to hold case files. She once dreamed of being a literature teacher until her ex-husband filed for full custody of their daughter, claiming she didn't have a stable enough job. She lost, not because she didn't love her child, but because the system believed a night shift waitress couldn't possibly secure a future for her daughter. 2 years later, she passed the bar exam and chose a path opposite of her ex-husband's. While he joined a firm specializing in legal investments, she chose to defend those nobody else would. Back then, no one believed she'd make it. Just like now, no one believed she could turn around a case about a 68-year-old janitor labeled hostile. One afternoon, while sitting in a wobbly cafe chair under flickering lights, Elena realized something. She was writing her defense argument by hand, not typing, not copying, just scribbling line by line as if the pencil itself might uncover what her mind couldn't. Because sometimes our thoughts run too fast, and only our hands can keep the right pace. While crossing out a sentence, her eyes caught a line in the report. Mr. Dane displayed behavior resembling that of someone once in authority, uncooperative with commentary that exceeded his position. A strange phrase, exceeded his position. Elena had heard that exact expression before in courtrooms, when a junior clerk offered an unconventional opinion and was swiftly shut down. That's beyond your station. No one outside the legal system uses that phrase accurately. It was a small detail, but it echoed Mr. Dane's words, "Don't ignore the small things." Elena started reviewing not just what Mr. Dane had said, but what he hadn't. No one knew what he used to do. There were no education records, but he knew the 1989 labor clause, and he used the exact legal language of someone who had worked enforcement. What would you do standing in front of a stranger yet feeling like you're facing a mirror into your own profession? That evening, Elena returned home earlier than usual. Her daughter May was at the table doing homework, and Elena just watched her. She remembered the first night after the divorce, bringing May home to an apartment with no couch, just a mattress and a rice cooker. May hadn't cried. She only asked, "Mom, would you be sad if I wanted to be a lawyer like you?" That one question told Elena no one needed to remind her of her past, because what she chose to face each day was already the clearest reminder. And so no matter how strange or buried Mr. Dane's case became, Elena decided not to walk away, not because he was special, but because his silence echoed her own from a time when no one asked, no one believed, and no one cared to hear her story all the way through. In her years as a public defender, Elena had encountered all kinds of defendants, those who shouted for justice, those who cried for forgiveness, those who stayed silent to protect themselves, and those who talked too much in self-defense. But Willis Dane, he was something else. He didn't shout, he didn't cry, he didn't even defend himself. He was still, in the most literal sense, as if everything happening around him was just a play he had already seen, and now he was sitting through the rerun just to see if anyone performed it better this time. On her second visit, Elena brought two things: a list of follow-up questions and a box of grilled chicken sandwiches from the cleaning lady who worked in his building. "Mr. Dane, I need to clarify a few things before the preliminary hearing." He nodded slightly, hands folded as if he were listening to an invisible symphony. "You once worked in the legal field." Nod. "Can you specify your role?" Silence. "Is there any file I can reference to support your case?" Still silence. Elena opened her notebook and checked the box non-cooperative. But in her head, she still heard his earlier words. "You don't need to win, you just need to keep the rhythm." It was a strange thing to say. In court, people remember winners. Who cares about rhythm? But as she looked back at Mr. Dane, she realized maybe he wasn't talking about court at all. "Are you afraid of losing this case?" she asked, half joking. He didn't laugh, but after a few seconds he replied softly, like the click of a fountain pen cap. "No, the scariest thing isn't losing. It's winning and not knowing why." That line stayed with Elena for the rest of the day, like a small stone in her shoe, not heavy enough to stop her, but impossible to forget. On her way home, she stopped at her old law school library, an old habit whenever something in her mind refused to settle. She pulled the registry of federal judges from the past 3 decades. There were no photos, but one name made her freeze. William S. Dane, federal judge, retired 2005, resigned after a controversial ruling on labor rights. Elena blinked. Willis Dane. William S. Dane. Same birth year, same last name. Could it be? She wasn't sure. But that instinct, the kind only single mothers have when they catch their child pretending to sleep, whispered loud and clear, "You're standing in front of something. That's not small." That night she reread the initial complaint report against Mr. Dane. His tone controlled. No resistance, not a single word of aggression. But every sentence was too professional. The next morning, during their third meeting, Elena didn't bring questions. She placed a small piece of paper on the table, a printout listing former federal judges. At the very bottom it read, "William S. Dane, retired 2005. Mr. Dane looked up at her. For the first time, he didn't nod. He didn't shake his head. He simply said, "You're starting to hear the rhythm." District Court 9, third floor hearing room. Worn-out wooden benches, dull fluorescent lights, and an air conditioner that wheezed like it was tired of working. Elena had walked into dozens of rooms like this, but that morning it felt more like a stage than a court of law. She stood alone at the defense table. Across from her, a 3-person legal team in sleek suits. Silver laptops open their expressions, more suited for a billion-dollar merger than a janitor fired for verbal aggression. Up on the bench, Judge Karen D. Lansing, known for her sharp tongue and zero tolerance for petty nonsense. And in the gallery, almost no one. No press, no colleagues, no friends or family of Mr. Dane. Just one elderly woman in the back row wearing a wine-colored shawl, silent as a statue. "Prosecution, your statement, please." Attorney Mark Trell, tall and polished, stood up and spoke in perfect textbook rhythm, "Your Honor. This case is not merely a violation of conduct. It is a cautionary tale about the latent disorder that can arise in a workplace environment." Elena nearly winced. Latent disorder. They were talking about a man who cleaned toilets, not a criminal mastermind. When it was her turn, Elena stood slowly and spoke gently. "Your Honor, we do not deny that a conversation occurred in the elevator, but I ask this court to consider, can a single sentence with no physical act, no witnesses, no recording truly justify ending the livelihood of a man who has worked quietly for 14 years? She glanced across the aisle. The opposing team didn't blink. For the next 40 minutes, the hearing felt like an off-key performance. The prosecution offered layers of circumstantial evidence, internal reports, supervisor statements, character evaluations. Elena had only a few smudged papers, and one witness not yet approved, Mr. Dane himself. "Your Honor, we object to Mr. Dane testifying," the prosecution insisted. "He brings no new information." Judge Lansing paused. She looked at Mr. Dane, still sitting quietly, hands on his lap, eyes steady, like he was listening to a hymn. She nodded once. "Overruled. Mr. Dane may testify, limited to 10 minutes. When he stepped up to the witness stand, the room stayed silent. No one picked up a pen. No cameras recorded. But Elena noticed one thing: the youngest attorney from the prosecution team. He flinched slightly at the sound of Dane's voice, not because it was wrong, but because it was familiar. And Dane said just 3 things. "I didn't threaten anyone. I simply reminded him that power does not excuse responsibility, and that I've seen powerful men fall, simply because they believed they no longer had to be humble." Then silence. No elaboration, no drama, but Elena could feel it. The air had shifted, not dramatically, but just enough, like someone had gently nudged the dial on a radio, and now the frequency in the room wasn't quite the same. During the recess, Elena stepped outside to retrieve more documents. That's when someone tapped her shoulder. It was the elderly woman from the gallery. She leaned in and whispered, "I used to be his clerk. 1997, Washington. If you need a copy of Decision 218 about employee rebuttal rights, check the Federal Archives. It's not digitized, but it's still filed." Then she walked away, leaving Elena on the courthouse steps with a chill that didn't come from the wind. That afternoon, after returning to her office at the Public Defender's Unit, Elena Rowe spread out all of Mr. Dane's documents across the desk. Every sheet of paper, every line about him, as if they were now putting truth on trial. Among the clutter, one item seemed utterly useless: a faded ID badge that HR had mistakenly printed the first time, but now it struck Elena like a red mark on a white shirt. Nobody noticed it before, but once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. On that badge, instead of the usual maintenance staff designation, it read, "External Review Employee Code, TR9. Elena frowned. That code didn't match the standard employee classifications. When she asked the HR manager, he laughed out loud. Probably a typo. Who the heck assigns TR9 to a janitor? Then he shrugged. Or maybe he's a robot in disguise. A joke, but in Elena's mind it wasn't funny. She reopened the Federal Legal Registry, the database listing individuals appointed as independent internal investigators for sensitive state and federal disputes. And there, on page 203 of a dusty 2002 report, she found the line TR9 Temporary Reviewer, classified for sensitive internal oversight appointments. Not a janitor, but a covert internal monitor deployed when an agency suspected corruption among its senior staff. Elena leaned back in her chair. Her palms were cold. Sometimes you don't need confirmation. You just need one detail out of place, and everything you've doubted suddenly makes too much sense. She revisited Mr. Dane's employment record. Everything looked ordinary except for one barely visible note. Previous workplace, see Direct Archive. Not digitized. That only happens in 2 cases. The individual worked in defense or high-level judiciary. The file had been sealed under identity protection protocols. Elena had never seen this for a janitor. That night, after May had gone to sleep, Elena quietly opened her laptop. She searched the archive mentioned by the woman in court. There, buried among rare scans, she found a faxed copy of a legal decision from 1997, handwritten, signed, stamped, classified, declassified in 2018. The signature at the bottom, Justice William S. Dane. She tapped the table with her finger like someone who'd just cracked half a forgotten cipher. Willis Dane. William S. Dane. Same birth year. Same signature, a subtle flourish at the end. This was no longer intuition. It was starting to feel like sheet music, and Mr. Dane was the one who had composed the melody. She had only just learned how to hum the intro. The following day, Elena walked into the holding area with only one question. "You were TR9, weren't you?" Mr. Dane looked at her, his eyes softened just a little. No confirmation, no denial. He simply asked if I was. "Then what?" Elena smiled. "Then I need to rewrite our entire defense strategy and maybe hire a bodyguard." For the first time, Mr. Dane laughed a quiet chuckle, like the click of a box being opened, one he had kept sealed for years. Some experts still argue, should a former federal judge, once at the height of judicial power, be allowed to work anonymously as a janitor in a private company with no background checks, no disclosures, no formal documentation? Sounds like the premise of a long-running TV drama. But if you've worked within the system long enough, you'll understand this. Sometimes the truth isn't hidden to protect itself, but to protect us from having to face it. Elena spent that entire night revisiting every case Justice William S. Dane had ever ruled on. His name was not a small one. He once led a special investigative panel focused on labor rights violations in federal corporations. He once ruled against companies for mistreating aging contract workers, and perhaps because of those decisions, he became a quiet target in both political and corporate circles. His final ruling before resignation, a controversial decision to prohibit the reinstatement of executives who had previously been investigated for internal misconduct. That ruling alone cost 6 major companies hundreds of millions of dollars. After that, he disappeared. The newspapers said he retired early for personal reasons, but Elena knew in law nothing is truly personal. Everything is a calculated choice. The next morning, Elena walked into her office with 2 coffees, one for herself and one for Lucas, a former colleague who now worked with a government watchdog group. "What's the occasion?" Lucas asked as she handed him the cup, like she was offering incense at a shrine. "Remember Judge William Dane, the one who vanished in 2005? "Sure, Michigan native. His father was a philosophy professor. His grandmother helped draft the updated procedural guidelines." Why, Elena lowered her voice, "I think. He's working as a janitor at Westlake Tower, and I'm defending him." Lucas went silent. In 6 years of oversight work, no one had ever said something that made him forget his coffee. They pulled up Westlake Group's internal personnel map, and something strange appeared. The management of Westlake had once been investigated by the very court Judge Dane had presided over before stepping down. Elena narrowed her eyes. "That can't be a coincidence." Lucas nodded. Maybe he wasn't fired for verbal threats. Maybe they found out who he was. But if that were true, the bigger question remained. Why didn't Dane fight back? He could have made a call. He could have leveraged his influence. He could have revealed his identity and rendered the entire trial irrelevant in seconds. But he didn't. Back at her desk, Elena flipped through her notes and paused at something he had said. "You don't need to win. You just need to keep the rhythm." And now she understood. It wasn't resignation. It was guidance. He didn't need to win this case. He was orchestrating something bigger, and she was the one he had chosen to keep the tempo. It was a cloudy afternoon. Elena stood outside the courtroom, the wind slipping through rows of stone benches, cold enough to bite. She held a file folder in her hands, but her eyes were fixed on Mr. Dane, sitting just a few steps away. His back was straight, his shirt collar slightly frayed but perfectly ironed. He looked like a man waiting for a bus, not a former judge, not someone recently fired for verbal threats, just an ordinary old man, still, quiet, as if he were listening to the rhythm of something no one remembered anymore. Elena walked over, meaning only to confirm a few things for the upcoming rebuttal session. But before she could speak, Mr. Dane looked up and said quietly, Clause 6C4, 1989 version, not the revised one. Elena froze. She had never mentioned that clause aloud. You mean the labor clause about rebuttal rights? She asked slowly. He nodded and said nothing more. Back at the office, Elena dug into the old legal archives. And just as he'd said in the 1989 version of the Federal Labor Code Clause 6C4 read, any individual under internal investigation retains the right to formally respond before a designated personnel review board, regardless of position or contractual status. But here's the thing, in the current version, that clause was gone. Not amended, not replaced, just gone. Did you know only about 4% of practicing attorneys still remember the original 1989 code, and of those only a tiny fraction have ever used it to defend the rights of laborers? Most see it as outdated, obsolete, irrelevant, kind of like how people might view a 68-year-old janitor. That night, Elena sat still staring at the clause ID and felt something stir inside her. It wasn't just a legal loophole, it was memory. The memory of cases overturned, employees fired without a chance to respond, corporations who knew that if that clause ever resurfaced, they could crumble. The following day, during the supplemental argument session, Elena stood slowly and clearly. Your Honor, the defense would like to submit one additional element that may fundamentally change the outcome of this case. Clause 6C4, original 1989 version. The courtroom stiffened. Judge Lansing looked up. The plaintiffs whispered among themselves. Attorney Trell sprang to his feet. That clause has been removed. It's no longer legally valid. Elena met his eyes. It wasn't replaced. It wasn't revised. And it was never officially repealed. It simply disappeared. A silence fell like the sound of a harp string snapping mid-note. Later that day, something strange happened. An anonymous envelope appeared on Elena's desk. Inside, a copy of an internal memo detailing the removal of Clause 6C4. No name, no number, just a handwritten note. The rhythm hasn't broken. Keep going. Tuesday, 10:43 a.m., same courtroom, faded wood paneling. The stale mix of old documents and overworked air conditioning. And that same wall clock, always 4 minutes behind. Elena Rowe stood up for the third time that day, but now no one was distracted. No one was bored. Even Judge Lansing, known for her cold efficiency, put down her pen and looked at Elena as if she had just tuned into a program that wasn't listed in today's docket. Elena Rowe, representing the defense, she began. With permission, I'd like to present Clause 6C4 from the original 1989 Federal Labor Code. She walked slowly to the podium. Her voice was calm, measured. According to this clause, any employee accused of internal misconduct holds the right to respond before an impartial review board regardless of rank, tenure, or contract type. The room didn't respond, but something shifted, as if someone had opened a window and a wind no one expected slipped in. Attorney Trell stood immediately. Objection. That clause is no longer part of the current labor code. We do not recognize it. Elena nodded, unfazed. Correct. But there was never an official repeal, no replacement, no revision. It was quietly erased. Judge Lansing leaned back, flipping through her binder. Do you have supporting evidence? She asked, not gently, but not dismissively either. Elena placed the facts on the table, then looked up. Original copy, signed by Justice William S. Dane in 1989, declassified in 2018, and most importantly, never formally revoked by any legal authority. Trell turned red. He whispered something to one of his team members, then started frantically flipping open his laptop. Moments later, the youngest member of the plaintiff team quietly slipped out of the courtroom. Just a few minutes passed. Then the courtroom secretary's landline rang. No one could hear what was being said, but the secretary nodded several times, then scribbled something on a slip of paper and handed it to Judge Lansing. She read it, eyes narrowing slightly. No one in the courtroom knew what had just happened, but Elena could feel it like a tremor beneath polished marble. Something had been touched, and the system was reacting. During the break, an older attorney from the plaintiff firm approached Elena in the hallway. Tall, salt and pepper hair, phone in hand like he had just received a very unwelcome call. "Ms. Rowe," he said cautiously, "perhaps we should consider settling before this goes to a higher court." Elena smiled politely. "I'm afraid I haven't received instructions from my client, and I don't negotiate over phone calls, especially when I'm not sure who's listening on the other end." That afternoon, an anonymous email was sent to all parties involved in the case. No subject line, no sender, just an image. The cover page of the 1989 Federal Labor Code stamped "effective until repealed," and beneath it a single line "valid until repealed." But who repealed it? That night, Elena Rowe didn't sleep, not because she was nervous about tomorrow's hearing, but because of something else, the sense that someone was watching. Not the peeking through your window kind of watching, but the kind where someone knows every word you've typed, every email you've sent, every sentence spoken in court that has now begun to ripple under the surface. 0:41 a.m. Her phone vibrated. No name, just unknown number. Caller ID not available. She answered groggily. "Hello." A man's voice, low, firm, but not threatening. "You're opening a door," one that many tried to shut back in 2005. Elena sat, upright eyes scanning the darkened room. "Who are you?" The man paused, then simply said, "I was on the internal advisory team under Dane. And I'll say this, don't look for who deleted the clause. Look for who ordered it." Then click. No goodbye, no number trace, just silence. Still gripping the phone, Elena sat there, heart not racing, but heavy. She wasn't afraid, but she now knew she had stepped into territory most attorneys veered away from early. The next morning she opened her inbox. Among the routine case updates and office chatter, an email stood out. No subject, no sender, just one attachment, daneconf.tdf. She opened it. It was an audio recording, a transcript of a closed-door meeting from the 2004 Legal Policy Council. In the clip, one familiar voice spoke, "I strongly oppose the removal of Clause 6C4. It forms the backbone of labor protection." Then a second voice, cold-clipped political, "William, you're holding back reform. We need to move forward, not cling to outdated policies because of sentiment." Elena froze. The first voice was unmistakably Dane. The second, she had heard it before in national news broadcasts. A current federal politician. She hadn't even finished downloading the file when the email disappeared. Not into spam, not in the trash. Gone. She tried opening the PDF again. The screen flashed, "File not found." By noon, another text popped up again from an untraceable number. The last time he appeared publicly was 2005, but what he built is still there. Check the Ellison Group case from that year, you'll see. Ellison Group. Elena's breath caught. That was the parent company of Westlake, where Dane had been fired. The circle hadn't just closed. She had drawn it herself. And from that moment forward, Elena understood. This case wasn't just about a janitor wrongfully terminated. This was about a system that had erased collective memory, and one man who still remembered the original rhythm of justice. Not everyone understands that silence doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes it means pressure gathering just before something breaks. Elena Rowe sat alone in her tiny kitchen. The clock read 1:16 a.m. The soft yellow light above her flickered gently on the wall, casting shadows like the folds of an old courtroom robe. On the table were three things: a handwritten defense draft, a photo of her daughter May sleeping, and a slip of paper that read, TR 9, C. Ellison 2005. She wasn't staying awake because of fear. She stayed awake because she knew tomorrow everything could pivot in a direction no one expected. In the other room, May, her 8-year-old daughter, was sound asleep. Before bedtime, she had left a new drawing on her mom's desk. This time it was a purple scale of justice with a loaf of bread balanced on one side. Justice has to eat too. May giggled when she handed it over. Elena hugged her, said nothing, but her mind went back to what Dane once told her: you don't need to win. You just need to keep the rhythm. Keeping the rhythm didn't mean dominating. It meant knowing when to speak and when to let silence say everything. Elena reviewed her old faxes, her scribbled notes, and a pencil-drawn comparison chart. On the left, legal truth. On the right, forgotten truth. In the middle, her name. She wasn't the first to fight for a lost law, but she might be the first to fall asleep over the case file juggling motherhood justice, and the fact that she still didn't own a printer. A new message blinked on her phone. No name, no number. If he reveals his real name tomorrow, be ready for backlash. Some will doubt. Some will panic. Don't let the noise drown out the music. She didn't respond. She simply placed the phone face down on the table, stood up, and brewed a cup of mint tea, not to stay awake, but to warm the hands that would steady her notes in the morning. Just before dawn, Elena dressed slowly, a plain white blouse, hair tied neatly. On her pocket she pinned a small note in a child's handwriting. Mom, keep the rhythm. She took a deep breath, then stepped out of her 47-square-meter apartment, carrying no title, no power, no spotlight, only a quiet faith that truth, though often forgotten, will always wake up when someone brave enough calls its name. That morning, the courtroom didn't feel like the ones before, not because the seats were more crowded, but because the eyes that filled them had changed. The lawyers who once smirked when Elena walked in alone had stopped smirking. Even Judge Lansing, usually sharp as a threadbare needle, paused just a little longer between sentences. Elena stood at the defense table, her hand resting lightly on the case file. Next to her sat Mr. Willis Dane, wearing a light gray suit, not new, but pressed as though it were being worn for the first time. And when she said, "Your Honor, the defense calls to the stand, Mr. Dane, or more accurately, former federal judge William S. Dane," the courtroom froze. No one objected. No one stood. Even the opposing team, 3 seasoned lawyers, looked like they'd been gently struck behind the head. Dane rose slowly, one step at a time, not rushing, not pausing, as if he had walked this path 1,000 times before, only this time he was walking it again. You could hear a pen roll off a clerk's desk. Judge Lansing, who had once served as a clerk herself in Michigan, tilted her head ever so slightly, a silent, almost imperceptible gesture of respect. Dane looked straight ahead. His voice didn't rise, but every word landed with the quiet weight of forged steel. "My name is William Samuel Dane. I served as a federal judge from 1991 to 2005. I chose not to reveal my identity while working as a janitor because I wanted to live as a regular citizen, someone who could observe the system without being observed by it." Elena didn't move. She didn't need to. Truth was now standing on its own 2 feet. He continued, his tone unwavering. "I wasn't fired for what I said in the elevator. I was fired because I had begun reinvestigating the very company Ellison Group that I once refused to clear during an internal manipulation case. That wasn't a defense. It was a quiet punch not to the stomach, but to the face of everyone who had assumed he was just the grumpy old man in the basement. The prosecution asked for a delay. Judge Lansing shook her head. "No, today we listen, because clearly We haven't been listening for the past 17 years. And so that morning in a pale wood-paneled courtroom, beneath flickering fluorescent lights, one man stood not to reclaim his reputation, but to return our belief in something greater. There are truths that don't need media coverage, don't need dramatic monologues, don't even need to be proven. They just need to be spoken at the right moment. And the moment William S. Dane stepped down from the witness stand, his expression as calm as if he had just completed a half-finished symphony from 2005. Everyone in that courtroom knew this was no longer a labor dispute. It was an overture. Within 1 hour of the recess, reporters began appearing outside the courthouse, not because Elena had called anyone, not because the prosecution had sounded an alarm, but because someone inside the courtroom had secretly recorded a clip the moment Dane revealed his real name and posted it to a private legal forum. 2 hours later, it hit a major news outlet. 3 hours in, it was trending on Reddit. By the 4th hour, William S. Dane had become one of the top search queries in the country. At the public defender's office where Elena worked, the phones wouldn't stop ringing. Half were congratulatory, the other half were cautionary. This is bigger than a wrongful termination case, Elena. Do you realize who you're going up against? Westlake has federal-level legal defense funds. Be careful. Don't win the case and lose your career. Elena just smiled. I'm not here to win. I'm here to keep the rhythm. The next day, the Federal Oversight Committee officially reopened the Ellison Group 2005 case, the one Dane had previously refused to whitewash. Within 48 hours, 2 Westlake board members were suspended pending investigation. One of the 3 plaintiff attorneys withdrew from the case entirely. But perhaps the most unexpected thing to land on Elena's desk that week wasn't a news feature, wasn't a subpoena, wasn't even a message from Dane. It was a handwritten letter, no return address, no signature, just 2 short lines. Back then I was wrong for staying silent. Today, seeing him still standing, I cried. Attached was an old photograph, a group standing in front of the Supreme Court in 1997, in the middle Dane, and beside him a woman with gray hair and dark sunglasses. Elena recognized her instantly, the elderly woman who had sat silently in the back row on the very first day of the trial. That night, Elena walked home late. It was drizzling. She didn't run. She simply walked step by step because for the first time in her life, as a single mom, as a public defender, as someone always underestimated, she felt the world was finally walking in rhythm with her. Some roads you walk not because you expect where they'll lead, but because you simply can't stand still. Elena Rowe never dreamed of being invited to Washington. She never imagined her name would appear on an official letterhead from the National Labor Law Reform Committee, stamped with a federal seal and 3 handwritten words at the bottom, "We need your rhythm." The letter arrived on a quiet Wednesday afternoon, just after she picked up May from school and was still deciding what to make for dinner. It was hand-delivered by a plain-clothed federal staffer. No fanfare, no speech, just a polite nod. "We'd like to invite you to speak at the upcoming open session on wrongful termination reform as a witness and as the one who helped preserve a clause nearly buried by time." May, sitting in the back seat, clutching her backpack, whispered, "Mom, is this like a movie?" Elena smiled and bent down. "No, sweetheart, this is real, and honestly, no movie would dare write it this way." Elena stood in a walnut-paneled hearing room bathed in soft amber light before an audience that included 7 senators, 3 senior legal advisors, and seated in the 3rd row, Mr. William S. Dane. He wasn't in a suit, just a pale blue shirt and a silver-gray tie, but his gaze alone made Elena straighten her posture. She opened with a sentence that landed like a single pure note in a room full of expectation. "I'm not here as one of the brilliant lawyers or as someone recognized by the system. I'm here as a single mother who was once told she wasn't stable enough to raise her own child and who simply didn't give up. She told the story about the case, about Clause 6C4, about the silence of a man who everyone overlooked but whose quiet presence reopened a voice for thousands who had never been allowed to speak. And she closed with this: if justice is music, then the law is the staff that holds each note in place. And if I contributed anything to this story, maybe it's that I listened long enough to hear the rhythm others tried to bury. There was no thunderous applause, just a long, full silence. The kind of silence that only happens when everyone in the room has just heard something they can't unhear. As she prepared to leave, a young policy aide approached to shake her hand. "You know," he said quietly, "when I go home tonight, I'm reopening every clause we've ever marked obsolete. Not to ask why, but to ask who ordered it gone." Elena smiled. "And hopefully, you'll also ask who chose not to walk away." 1 month after the trial ended and the media buzz faded like a tired tide, Elena Rowe stood exactly where it had all begun, in front of a small elementary school waiting for her daughter May to come out on a Friday afternoon. No news vans, no invitations, no headlines, just a single mom standing under the shade of a red maple tree, holding a leftover lunchbox from her morning meetings. And when May came running out bouncing as if nothing important had ever happened in the world, Elena smiled and bent down. "What special thing do you want for dinner tonight?" May thought for a moment, then said, "I want you to read me a story. The one about when you went to Washington." Elena laughed. "That one. The story where Mommy sat in a freezing cold room, trying not to let her knees shake while talking to 7 of the most powerful people in the country." May nodded, eyes wide. That evening, in their tiny apartment under the dim glow of a yellow lamp and the soft hum of the ceiling fan, Elena didn't read from a press release or a speech. She read a section from the part of her testimony she never got to finish. We don't need the loudest voices, we just need to keep the rhythm of our own hearts and listen for the breath of those who've been silenced, because sometimes just one person keeping rhythm is enough to keep the whole song from falling apart. As for Mr. Dane, the man once called that stubborn old janitor, he now lives quietly in a small wooden house up north. Every so often, Elena receives a letter from him. No long paragraphs, no grand reflections. Just 3 words, rhythm still steady. Elena never changed careers. She's still a public defender, still types on the same old keyboard, still fights over forgotten cases no one else cares about. But every time she rises in court, every single time, she whispers to herself, "I don't have to win, I just have to keep the rhythm, and you, the one still listening. Maybe you've stayed silent before because fear made you small. Maybe you've watched injustice happen and thought, what difference can I make?" But if there's one lesson Elena Rowe would want to pass on, one rhythm, she hopes you still hear in this final beat. It's this: justice doesn't need you to do something grand. It just needs you to hold the beat long enough for others to follow. Thank you for walking with us to the very end of this journey. If your heart stirred at any point, drop us a comment, or just tell someone close, "I heard a story today about a single mother and a former judge who once mopped floors." Now, turn off the lights, breathe in, keep your heart steady, and smile, because justice, even when delayed, always knows how to knock on the right door. See you in the next story from SocialJustice.